What medieval marriage was really like. Somewhere in a small stone church on a cold morning, two young people are standing side by side, waiting for a priest who has not yet arrived. Outside, the wind is bending the trees. Inside, the candles have not yet been lit, and when the man beside her reaches for her hand, she looks up at him and understands, in that single quiet moment, that everything the modern world has told her about this day is wrong. You are standing at the edge of a story you think you know. A story of child brides sold like cattle. A story of loveless bargains made by cruel fathers. A story of women crushed beneath the weight of laws written by men. Some of that story is true, but much of it, the part everyone repeats, the part every film reaches for, is not what the records actually show. The truth of medieval marriage is stranger, darker in some places, gentler in others, and far more human than the cartoon that has come down to US across the centuries. Behind every wedding in that thousand-year age lay a tangle of laws, fears, ambitions, love letters, secret vows, brutal fees, watchful witnesses, and quiet acts of resistance that no simple story can hold. And tonight, we are going to walk through all of it. Welcome to Medieval Secrets Unlocked, the myth that won't die. Picture the medieval wedding in your imagination. A frightened girl of 12, a cruel father counting coins, a husband 3 times her age with a cold smile, a priest reading Latin no one understands, a dowry passing from one man to another like a bag of grain. That image has been printed in 1,000 novels and 100 films, and for most people in the medieval world, it is almost entirely false. The records tell a very different story. Across most of Europe, peasant women, who made up the vast majority of the population, married in their early to mid-20s. Their husbands were often only a few years older. In many regions, both bride and groom had worked for years before marriage, saving small amounts of money, gathering a bed, a chest, a few pots, the basic furniture of an adult life. Marriage was not something done to a child. It was something done by 2 adults who had waited, sometimes half their youth, for the chance to build a household of their own. Church law did allow marriage from 12 for a girl and 14 for a boy, the minimum ages considered biologically mature. But the difference between what the law allowed and what people actually did was enormous. Just because a girl could legally marry at 12 did not mean anyone expected her to. In fact, the studies of parish records that survive tell us again and again that early teenage marriage was the exception, not the rule. The child bride image has a source, but that source is narrow. In the highest nobility, especially for royal alliances, girls could indeed be married very young. A princess might be betrothed at 7 and sent to a foreign court at 12, married in name to seal an alliance between kingdoms. Those cases were rare, dramatic, and heavily recorded, which is why they survive in the imagination, while the ordinary marriages of ordinary people have quietly faded. Here's the twist. Medieval Europe, for most of its people, was not a world of child marriage. It was a world of late marriage, careful planning, and long courtship. The horror stories are real, but they belong mostly to the top of society. Beneath the crowns, the truth was quieter and stranger than the legend. The law that protected the bride. Now step inside the mind of the medieval church, which controlled marriage law across most of Europe for nearly 1,000 years. And here you will find one of the great surprises of this whole story. Church law required, absolutely and without exception, that both the bride and the groom freely consent to the marriage. Not the father, not the mother, not the lord of the manor, the 2 people standing at the altar. If either of them refused or was coerced, the marriage was not valid. It could be challenged in a church court, and church courts across the medieval centuries actually heard such challenges, and sometimes ruled in favor of the young person who had been forced. Read that again, because it contradicts almost everything popular history has told you. In the age we imagine as the darkest for women's freedom, the official law of the most powerful institution in Europe insisted, on parchment and from the pulpit, that no one could be married against their will. Court records from medieval England and France survive with case after case in which a young woman or a young man argued that a marriage arranged by their family should be annulled because they had never truly consented. Some of these cases succeeded. A daughter forced into a match by a domineering father could, in principle, appear before a church court, tell her story, and be freed from a union she had never wanted. Did it always work? Of course not. Fathers pressured daughters. Families arranged unions. Powerful lords bent rules. A frightened girl standing in front of her family and a priest was not always in a position to say no, even if the law said she could. The gap between the ideal and the reality was often wide and sometimes cruel. A woman who defied her family risked being disowned, sent to a nunnery, or worse. But do not miss what this means. The idea that a marriage must rest on the free will of both partners is not a modern invention. It was fought for, defined, and defended, imperfectly but seriously, by medieval church lawyers 1,000 years ago. Every wedding in the modern West that asks the couple to say the words, "I do," is echoing a rule set down in stone chambers by monks and canon lawyers whose names have been forgotten. Consent was medieval before it was modern. The secret weddings. No one could stop. But here's where the story turns strange in a way you were never taught. For most of the medieval period, a church wedding with a priest and witnesses and vows read aloud on the church steps was the ideal. It was not the requirement. Two people could marry themselves. Legally. Fully. Without a priest. Without a ceremony. Without a document. All that was needed was a promise, spoken in the present tense, between a man and a woman of legal age, in front of a witness or even alone. I take you as my husband. I take you as my wife. Those words, said with sincere intent, created a marriage that church courts across Europe would recognize as fully binding. Picture what this meant on the ground. A young woman meets a young man at a fair in the next village. They fall in love. Their families would never approve. They slip behind a hedge, or into a small chapel, or up to a hayloft, and they say the words to each other. From that moment on, in the eyes of the highest law of the age, they are married. When they return to their villages, no father, no lord, no priest can undo what they have done. These were called clandestine marriages, and they drove church officials, kings, and noble families to distraction. Court records across medieval Europe are full of cases in which a young woman insisted she was already married to a man of her own choosing, while her family insisted she must marry someone else. Judges had to sort out whose story was true. Sometimes the young woman won. Sometimes she lost. But the fact that these cases exist at all tells you something the storybooks do not. Ordinary medieval people were not passive victims of their families. Many of them, especially the young, used the law to fight back. Sometimes they won. And every time they won, they proved that medieval marriage was not the frozen institution the myths describe. To slow this down, the Great Church Council of the early 13th century introduced something called the reading of the banns. 3 Sundays in a row before any wedding, the priest was to announce the coming marriage from the pulpit and ask if anyone knew a reason why it should not go forward. If a former secret lover, or a previous clandestine spouse, or a hidden family relationship existed, someone was supposed to speak now, before the wedding was blessed. The banns were a brilliant and quietly desperate attempt to bring the chaos of medieval love under church control. They worked, imperfectly, but for centuries before, and even for decades after, love and stubbornness had their own legal weapon. And ordinary people used it. The fines that bought a life. Now shift your view from the church to the manor house. Because for a peasant, marrying was not only a matter of love or law, it was also a matter of money paid to the Lord. Picture yourself as a young peasant woman about to marry. You and your future husband have chosen each other. Both families approve. The priest is willing. But before any of that can matter, someone must walk up to the manor and pay a fee to the lord who owns the land your father works. In many parts of medieval Europe, this fee was called merchet. It was the price of the lord's permission for you to marry. Why did the lord want the money? Because your labor mattered to him. Because your future children mattered to him. Because if you married a man from another manor, you might leave, and the Lord would lose your work, your husband's work, and the work of every child you would ever raise. So he charged a fee, sometimes a small fee, sometimes a crushing one, depending on the Lord and the times. If you could not pay, you could not marry. Or you married anyway, in secret, and lived with the fear of being punished. Some couples borrowed the money. Some worked extra seasons to save it. Some resented it for the rest of their lives. There is another myth that must be addressed here. The famous idea that medieval lords had the legal right to take the virginity of every peasant bride on her wedding night has almost no evidence behind it in the actual records. Modern historians have looked long and carefully for real cases of this so-called right, and they mostly find only later stories told to make the medieval past look darker than it was. That specific legend appears to be an invention of the centuries after the medieval world ended, spread by writers who wanted to make the old order look uglier than it truly was. But the merchant fee was real, and it tells you something important. Even when medieval peasants loved freely and chose freely, their choice cost them in coin paid to a man who never met them. For the privilege of building the ordinary life every human being deserves to build. The church blessed the union. The Lord took his cut. The property exchanged behind every wedding. For those higher up on the social ladder, marriage was almost never just about love or law. It was a transfer of wealth, and the exchange followed rules that shaped the entire fate of every noble family. In the classical medieval world, the bride's family typically provided a dowry. This was money, land, jewels, or valuable goods that traveled with her into her new marriage. It was, in effect, her share of her family's wealth handed over at the moment she left. Dowries could be enormous. For a great heiress, the dowry might include entire estates, castles, or even claims to distant kingdoms. Wars were fought over dowries that were never paid. Kings sometimes married primarily to gain the lands a bride would bring with her. But the exchange did not go in one direction only. The husband, in turn, was expected to provide something called a dower. This was the portion of his own estate that would legally belong to his wife if he died before her. It was her security, her insurance against widowhood, her protection in a world that could turn cruel very quickly for a woman without resources. Together, the dowry and the dower shaped everything. A father with several daughters faced a real financial crisis. Each daughter needed to be married with a dowry large enough to attract a respectable husband, and the family's total wealth had to be stretched across every marriage. Poorer families sometimes could not afford dowries for all their daughters. Younger daughters were sometimes sent to nunneries, not because they had a religious calling, but because the family could not afford to marry them off. You can feel the weight of this in the letters and wills that survive. A father lying on his deathbed, dictating a will that carefully sets aside a specific sum for each unmarried daughter, knowing that his death could ruin their futures if he did not plan carefully. A widow, decades later, still holding on to her dower lands and refusing to remarry because she has finally, at long last, become the mistress of her own life. Love was a beautiful thing in the medieval world. Property was a colder one. Both stood at every altar. The night everyone watched. Now step into the wedding itself and prepare yourself, because what happened at some medieval weddings is unlike anything at a modern one. The ceremony itself often took place not inside the church, but on the church steps, in the open air, before the priest led the couple inside for the blessing. Rings were exchanged, in a tradition inherited from ancient Rome and Christianized over the centuries. Words were spoken, hands were joined. In some parts of Europe, a cloth was wrapped around the couple's joined hands to symbolize their binding. A ritual that gave us the phrase to tie the knot, and the older tradition sometimes called hand fasting. After the ceremony came the feast, which for peasant families could be modest, and for noble families could last for days. Musicians played. Neighbors danced. The bride and groom sat together, sometimes for the first time in their lives, and were toasted by everyone they had ever known. But among the nobility especially, and sometimes among wealthy commoners too, the wedding day did not end at the feast. It ended in the bedroom, and the couple was not alone there. The bedding ceremony was a real medieval and early modern practice. After the feast, the bride and groom were escorted to their marriage bed, sometimes by a whole procession of family and guests. In the highest circles, witnesses stood in the room. They watched the couple get into the bed together. In some noble marriages, they even remained until the marriage was consummated. Then, and only then, was the union considered complete beyond challenge. Imagine the humiliation of that moment for a young bride. Imagine being 15 or 16, standing in front of your relatives, your husband's relatives, and possibly officials of the church or the state, expected to lie down in a bed while they all watched to make sure a marriage became real. Why was this done? Because marriage law had a loophole. A marriage that was never consummated could, in certain cases, be annulled. For a royal union that had cost years of diplomacy, or a noble marriage that had cost a fortune in dowry, no one wanted the possibility of that loophole opening years later. So they closed it in public. Or rather, they closed it in front of enough witnesses that no one could ever open it again. For ordinary couples, none of this applied. Their weddings were smaller, warmer, freer. A feast in the village. Songs. Dancing. A shared bed with a door that closed behind them. But at the top of society, love, or the appearance of it, was a public performance from the vows to the very sheets. That was the price of a crown, and of the alliances crowns depended on. The love that lived outside the vows. But here is one of the strangest truths about medieval marriage. In much of the noble literature that survives, love and marriage are almost never the same thing. In the high medieval centuries, a whole new tradition of poetry and song began spreading to the courts of southern France and beyond. It celebrated what we now call courtly love. In this tradition, a knight fell hopelessly in love with a noble lady, usually already married to someone else. He served her from afar. He composed songs in her honor. He fought tournaments carrying her token. He suffered beautifully, publicly, endlessly. And she, in most cases, remained distant, unreachable, adored but never openly loved. The troubadours who spread this literature turned love itself into an art form. They gave Europe some of its earliest and most passionate poetry. They also gave it a startling idea. That true romantic transformative love was something that happened outside marriage, not inside it. This makes sense once you remember what noble marriage was. A political contract. An alliance of properties. An agreement between fathers, brokered by lawyers, blessed by priests. Whether the two people at the altar felt anything for each other was, in the great matches, almost beside the point. So the imagination of the age, hungry for something more, invented a shadow world where love could still exist. In secret glances, in exchanged letters, in vows made under trees no priest had blessed. How much of this actually happened, and how much was fantasy sung for entertainment, has been debated by historians for a very long time. The reality was probably a messy mixture. Some noble affairs certainly took place. Others existed only in poetry. But the idea itself, the notion that love was worth writing about, took hold in the medieval imagination and never left. Worth suffering for, worth risking everything to feel. Every modern love song, every romance novel, every film that treats love as a force greater than convention owes something to those medieval troubadours. They did not invent love, but they helped invent the modern language for it, and they did so quietly in the shadow of marriages that were mostly not about love at all. The lovers who paid for everything. If you want a single true story that captures how love, marriage, and cruelty collided in the medieval world, consider the tale of two 12th century figures whose letters have survived across nearly 900 years. He was one of the most brilliant teachers in Paris. She was the gifted niece of a powerful churchman, well educated for a woman of her age. He was hired to tutor her. They fell in love. They became lovers. She became pregnant. And when her uncle discovered what had happened, the story took a turn so brutal that it still shocks modern readers. They tried, in secret, to do what medieval law technically allowed. They married, but they hid the marriage, because a public wedding would have destroyed his career in the church. Her uncle, humiliated and enraged, sent men to attack her lover in the night. What they did to him was so severe that he could no longer live as a normal man in the world. Both of them ended their days in monasteries, separated forever, writing letters that speak, across the centuries, of a love that even mutilation and exile could not entirely destroy. Their letters survive. They are among the most powerful documents of the medieval age. They show two people who genuinely loved each other, who tried to build a real marriage inside a society that punished such things when the wrong families disapproved, and who paid for it with everything they had. They were not typical, but they were real. And their story tells you something the myths of medieval marriage almost never show. That behind the fees and the contracts and the political alliances, there were people, ordinary and extraordinary, who loved each other so deeply that they were willing to lose their futures, their bodies, and their names for the chance to say the words out loud. Love in the medieval world was not always safe, but it was never as absent as the storybooks suggest. The widow who owned the world. Now here is one of the most surprising truths about medieval marriage. The freest woman in medieval society was often not the young bride. It was the older widow. Under most medieval legal systems, a married woman had few independent rights. In the tradition later formalized in English common law as coverture, a wife's legal identity was considered to be merged with her husband's. Her property was managed by him. Her earnings often belonged to him. Her decisions in most matters required his consent. She could not usually sign contracts on her own. She could not usually sue in court on her own. In the eyes of the law, she was, in effect, a shadow of her husband. But when he died, everything changed. A widow, in many parts of medieval Europe, inherited her dower, a substantial portion of her husband's estate, often for the rest of her life. She could run his business. She could manage his lands. She could sign contracts. She could take on apprentices. She could, in many towns, join her late husband's guild and continue his trade under her own name. In some cities, entire workshops were quietly run by widows who had inherited the tools and the customers of their husbands and had no intention of giving them up. She could also remarry if she chose. About a third of medieval widows did, sometimes to men younger than themselves. And she could refuse to remarry, keeping her independence, her income, and her authority over her own household. Picture a widow at the market in a busy medieval town. She is in her 40s, dressed in dark cloth, buying supplies for the workshop that used to belong to her husband. Apprentices work for her. Merchants know her by name. The priest greets her with respect. She has children, land, savings, and, for the first time in her life, no man legally set above her. She has, in some ways, more freedom than any other adult woman in her society. This was not every widow's experience. Poor widows often struggled terribly. Some were pushed into remarriage by families who wanted the property back in male hands. Some faced grinding poverty in old age. Some, especially wealthy heiresses, were even the targets of a very medieval crime, bride kidnapping, in which ambitious men would seize a wealthy widow or single heiress and try to force a marriage in order to gain control of her lands. Court records mention such cases across the medieval centuries, but for those who had wealth or a trade and could defend themselves, widowhood was often the freest chapter of a long life. And medieval women knew it. The marriage that cannot be undone. But what if a marriage went wrong before death separated the couple? Here, medieval Europe was harsh in a way the modern world often forgets. There was no divorce in the sense we mean it today. A marriage, once made and consummated, was, in the eyes of the church, a bond for life. No abuse, no cruelty, no unhappiness could dissolve it. Death was the only true escape. There were, however, ways out for those who could afford them. A church court could grant an annulment, a declaration that a marriage had never truly existed in the first place. Grounds included that the couple were too closely related by blood, that one partner had been forced, that the marriage had never been consummated, or that one partner had already been secretly married to someone else before the wedding took place. The powerful used these grounds ruthlessly. One of the most famous cases in the entire medieval record involved a French queen in the 12th century whose long marriage to her royal husband produced only daughters and no son to inherit the crown. After 15 years, the church annulled the marriage on grounds of consanguinity, the claim that the two spouses were too closely related. Both of them had known about that supposed relationship the entire time. It had not mattered when the marriage was politically useful. It mattered enormously when it no longer was. She walked away with her ancestral lands and, within weeks, was married again to another ruler, one who would become one of the most powerful kings in Europe. Kings, nobles, and wealthy men used these legal tools when it suited them. Convenient family connections were discovered that had somehow escaped notice for a decade. Nobles suddenly remember secret pre-contracts that made their current marriages invalid. Wealthy women sought annulments to escape husbands who had proven violent or cold. It was a legal system with plenty of room for manipulation, especially if you had money and lawyers. For ordinary people, annulment was a distant, expensive hope. Most peasant couples had no way to unwind a marriage that had gone wrong. They lived with it. They separated informally, one partner leaving to another town, disappearing into the anonymous roads of medieval Europe. Some remarried illegally in a place where no one knew them. Others simply endured. A written account left by one late medieval Englishwoman, a devout Christian who traveled widely and dictated the story of her life to a scribe, describes the deep unhappiness of her marriage, the pressure of endless childbirth, and the years of quiet negotiation with her husband before he finally agreed to a vow of chastity that gave her back some control over her own body. A written account left by one late medieval Englishwoman, a devout Christian who traveled widely and dictated the story of her life to a scribe, describes the deep unhappiness of her marriage, the pressure of endless childbirth, and the years of quiet negotiation with her husband before he finally agreed to a vow of chastity that gave her back some control over her own body. She had 14 children before that agreement. Her voice, one of the earliest surviving in her language from a woman of ordinary status, is a rare open window into what a difficult medieval marriage actually felt like from the inside. She was not unusual. She was only unusually able to leave a record. The price of every child. For most medieval women, marriage meant something the modern world barely remembers. Almost constant pregnancy. And every pregnancy carried a real chance of death. Picture a young medieval bride, married at 22, healthy, hopeful. Within a year, she is pregnant. She will spend most of the next 15 or 20 years either pregnant, nursing, recovering from her birth, or preparing for the next one. She may bear 8 or 10 children. In many households, half of those children will not live to see their 5th year. She will bury small bodies again and again. And each time, she will keep going. Childbirth itself. In an age without antiseptics, without antibiotics, without safe surgery, was one of the great killers of medieval women. A difficult labor could last for days. Infections after birth could take a healthy young woman within a week. Historians estimate that a significant percentage of medieval women died in childbirth or from its complications over the course of their reproductive lives. So many that many women, before going into labor, quietly made their wills, said their goodbyes, and received the last rites of the church in case they did not survive. Marriage in the medieval world was not only about love or property, it was about facing that risk again and again for years. The husband stood outside the birthing chamber, forbidden by custom to enter. Midwives worked by candlelight. Other women of the village, mothers themselves, held the young wife's hand and whispered prayers. Sometimes those prayers were answered. Sometimes they were not. This is the piece of medieval marriage that romance novels almost never show. The quiet, constant courage it took from women who did not think of themselves as brave to be a wife in a world where being a wife could kill you at any moment. The quiet, constant courage it took from women who did not think of themselves as brave to be a wife in a world where being a wife could kill you at any moment. Every noble portrait of a smiling medieval woman with several small children beside her is a story of survival that could easily have ended differently at any of a dozen deliveries. Behind every medieval marriage stood a woman who lived every year in the shadow of a door she might not walk back through. WHY. It still matters. Step out of the church now. Step out of the manor. Step out of the birthing chamber. Come back to your own time. You might think medieval marriage has nothing to teach the modern world. Arranged unions, bedding ceremonies, lords collecting fees, wives with almost no legal power, widows finally free only when their husbands were in the ground. It looks like a foreign country, and in many ways it is. But look closer. The idea that both people must freely consent to a marriage was written into law during those centuries. Imperfect, but real. The idea that a widow deserves rights over her own property was built out of medieval court cases. The idea that ordinary people, not only kings, could choose their own partners for reasons of the heart was carried forward by the stubborn clandestine marriages of young lovers in fields and haylofts across 1,000 years. The idea that love itself is a subject worth serious poetry, worth songs, worth being written down and passed on, was shaped by troubadours whose names most of us have forgotten. Medieval marriage was often cruel. It was often loving. It was often both in the same house at different hours of the same day. It was a human institution shaped by human beings, with all the beauty and all the failure that phrase implies. The deepest lesson these old records leave us is this. The story of marriage is not a straight line from oppression to freedom. It is a long, uneven struggle in which women and men across every century have tried, sometimes bravely and sometimes badly, to build something honest between themselves. Our age is one more chapter in that struggle. It is not the ending. It is not even, in the long view of history, a particularly settled middle. The people at that altar, so long ago, were not so different from you. They wanted safety. They wanted companionship. They wanted, when they were lucky, to be loved. Most of the time, they had no idea whether they would get any of it. They said the words anyway. The hand that reached for hers. Now return one last time to that small stone church on the cold morning. The candles are lit. The priest has arrived. The two young people stand side by side. Around them, the village has gathered. Somewhere in the crowd, a mother is weeping quietly. Somewhere else, a father is trying to look stern and failing. And when the priest asks the young woman if she takes this man freely, of her own will, without pressure or fear, she looks up. She looks at her family. She looks at the young man beside her. And then she answers. Her answer, whatever it is the same answer that has echoed inside every wedding ceremony held in the Western world for the last 1,000 years. The words have changed. The clothing has changed. The music, the food, the rings, the venues, all of it has changed. But the moment when one human being is asked whether they truly want to bind their life to another, and whether they choose to say yes, is a moment the medieval world helped invent. You inherited it from them. Every wedding you have ever been to began, in some quiet way, in a courtroom of monks and lawyers arguing about consent, in a hayloft where two young people spoke the words alone, in a marriage bed washed by too many strangers, in a widow's shop where a woman signed her own name on her own contracts for the first time in her life, in a monastery cell where a woman wrote letters to a lover she would never see again. The medieval story is not the opposite of ours. It is the beginning of ours. If this made you see history differently, hit subscribe, because next week we're opening another door history tried to close. And before you go, comment below and tell me this. If you had lived in a medieval village, and your family had chosen a husband or wife for you that you did not love, would you have risked a clandestine marriage with the person you truly wanted, knowing what it could cost you? Your answer says more about you than you think. Because in the end, the truth about the past is often stranger than the myth.